at 2305 with Philip Crosby. We are wrapping Unit 3 material. We really kind of wrapped Unit 3 this past week, but there's one kind of final lecture to get through the kind of remaining elements of looking at the modern presidency to today. So we've kind of got one more hangover lecture to kind of get through, and then we'll jump into a little bit of the judiciary before finishing class. We really don't have a lot of class left, so appreciate all of you kind of staying with me and hanging out and working through some of this really complicated information as we try to understand just what exactly the American presidency is, what it has been, and what it needs to be in the future for a somewhat stable world. And so when we looked at this last time, we were looking at this idea of America becoming an empire concerned with global control, which a lot of times it's perceived to be, and the president sits atop of that, really comparing the 1787 presidency of George Washington with this 2023 presidency of Joe Biden, where because of the size and the scope and the military power and economic power of the United States, the presidency and the president's power has overwhelmingly increased just because the size of our nation has increased. So the idea of protect and defend is so much more significant today than it was in 1787. And this is a question we really kind of have to wrap our minds around if we're going to understand what person or what type of person really makes a good president. And so we looked at this kind of idea of, has America become an empire, or is America assuming the role of global peace? I humbly suggested it's both. I think America is trying to do something that's not been done. The last empire that really did this was Great Britain. Great Britain really conquered and destroyed, and they used a heavy fist. It was more of a Hobbesian kind of government. They went into places across the globe, and they really kind of ruled with a strong military presence, a strong kind of undermining of local governments and local cultures and local affairs. One of the reasons we declared our independence here in America is because of some of the totalitarian aspects of the British Empire. And so America is kind of like modeling this global economic prowess, but we're trying to remedy some of the errors of totalitarianism. And so America going in, we tend to be more graceful when it comes to allowing cultural norms. We tend to be more graceful when it comes to allowing them to kind of control their own politics and their own things. But at the end of the day, we do have an agenda, and we do want to see that agenda kind of managed. And that agenda is peace, so people can make money. And so it's like, how do we parse this out? How do we actually build this on? And so we kind of wrapped up last time looking at, since America has taken control of, or that leadership of the world, we have seen notable, tangible benefits across the globe. When we start talking about the world as such a dangerous place and the world is whatnot, actually it's not. The world today is one of the safest, most secure, most wealthy places, or, not places, but one of the wealthiest times that has ever existed in the grand scope of human history. I mean, if you're living today, you are far safer and far wealthier than if you were living at almost any other time in human history, and yet it doesn't feel that way. It's constantly made to seem quite the opposite. And so it's important for us to kind of understand the progression of what exactly happened and what are we trying to do, because this sets up what America does after World War II. And again, it's kind of leaning back on what we have discussed. If you kind of remember everything we've done from the crash course here of American history, let's use green today. This Atlantic Ocean, this was all part of the Columbian Exchange. And if you remember, going into the 16th and 17th century, we really started building a Columbian Exchange that was managed by England. England had this exchange that would come here, come over to America, and then come back to England. And so this is what we call the Columbian Exchange. It was a massive trade route that was built in the Atlantic Ocean. If you remember back in the War of 1812, the War of 1812 was fought because Britain was tampering down the American ability to trade in this Columbian Exchange. We had shown that we could liberate ourselves in the colonies colonies from Great Britain here in America, but we also showed that we were painfully inadequate at defending our trade, defending our livelihood over in the Atlantic. And the British government had a well-established Atlantic control. They had ports in Africa, they had ports coming in the Mediterranean, they had ports down here in the Spice Islands. The British had also kind of moved around the Horn of Africa, and they were coming into the areas of England and whatnot. And so we have this kind of idea that the British had really secured this, and they were beginning to push in here, forcing China to shut down. India is going to go through some religious dissent. The Middle East is going to be caught in a wave of chaos for a lot of different reasons for the next 400 or 500 years, as different caliphs and whatnot begin taking control of the legacy of what Muhammad started. And so when we start looking at what's going on in the world, it's important to understand that what's happening here is really owned and controlled by the British. So when the Americans kind of set their course, Americans set their course not to challenge the British here. Remember the War of 1812? The Britain finally recognized our authority and we said, okay, but we actually go this way. We actually push west, and we continue to push west because our goal, in my humble estimation, is this. If you can push west and you can get all of this, now America can basically emulate in the Pacific what the British were able to do in the Atlantic, of really kind of securing and nailing down a global trading empire. Now, again, we want to remedy some of the mistakes we learned from Great Britain, but this is one of the things I think America kind of has their sights on, which is why we have these kind of conceptions of manifest destiny, sea to shining sea, but we never stopped. Once we hit California, we continue to go on. We pushed in. Hawaii offers a strategic location in the Pacific, and Hawaii and Alaska both were territories for quite a while before we kind of offered them statehood, because we wanted to have this military ability to go in and set these states up, set these territories up as strategic locations. Alaska is 5 feet from Russia. And so when we start looking at this, this is going to bring North America, or the American, primarily into conflict potentially with, right, guess who, right? You're going to have Russia and China. The modern conflict is really kind of built from this kind of thing. Now, Japan is right here. Japan was a very, very important piece of the pie as well. But Japan really was leaning on an antiquated understanding of the way Britain did it originally. And Japan caused problems with the way they went in, totalitarian, and their threat was in many ways neutralized in World War II. And they become one of America's greatest allies in the Pacific Ocean. Which is why, like today, it's really kind of ironic that Japan and the United States get along so well, and we get a lot from Japan, and Japan gets a lot from us. And so we still have this conflict kind of emerging in. But if you think about the major conflicts we've been in over the course of the last 40 years, we have a conflict in Vietnam here. We have a conflict of Taiwan, which is going to be here. We have a conflict coming into the India, and how is India going to play in this new modern world? We have the conflict of Afghanistan and Pakistan kind of pushing in. Why? Because we're kind of pushing into these things up in here and trying to build these kind of port cities in here. So there's something that America's trying to do if we step back and see the bigger picture. But it requires that our president see it, understand it, and maintain course, because you're not going to be able to do this haphazardly, and you're not going to be able to do this on a whim. You actually have to stay the course. And this is something that's quite interesting when you start looking at what presidents have done and what we want them to do. So as we jump into some of the information, one of the things we have to kind of reconcile is just the sheer growth of presidential power given what the cost of war was. Following the beginning of World War II, the attack on Pearl Harbor actually pushed us to kind of give the president an expanded war-making power, given the ability of a foreign nation to launch an attack of the size of Pearl Harbor. And so we have this kind of Modified War Powers Act of 1941. This expanded the presidential authority, and it really kind of gave the president, some would consider nearly unlimited authority to use the American might the way he saw fit. And so some people are like, oh, that's not a big deal. But remember, in 1941, we're still playing with modern weapons. Nuclear weapons aren't created yet. It's still kind of a kind of land, ground and pound kind of military force. The Air Force still really isn't developed in a great way. We started playing with sophisticated air forces in World War One. We're going to develop them more extensively in World War II, but for what we're seeing today, it's still very primitive. We're still far from jets and stealth bombers and stuff like that. But we see this kind of necessary kind of component of the presidency needing to be increased in power and authority, primarily to accommodate the elements of what happened in World War II or with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. However, once we kind of give that president power, it's very hard to take power back away from the president. And so the presidency that we empowered in World War II, following World War II, when subsequent presidents began to use that power in other ways, we began to rethink that power and try to pull it back. Vietnam overwhelmingly kind of begins to cause a question mark on just how much power we should give the president of the United States. Should we warrant the president of the United States with nearly unlimited power of the U.S. military? And in 1973, Congress, by vote of Congress, said, no, we want to check this. We want to pull this back. But I want you to kind of look at what was the check on the president. This happened in the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And at that time, in 1973, because of the perceived abuses of power by the presidents, and this is John F. Kennedy, this is Lyndon Baines Johnson, and most notably, this is Richard Nixon, 1973, the abuses of the presidency, they wanted to pull back the power the president have. And I want to read this so you can kind of really understand what we're pulling the back, right? This is what we reduced the presidency to. Troops can only be used with statutory authorization. So statutory authorization is authorization by virtue of something else. So if we have a treaty in place, if we have an agreement in place, if there's some other thing that already gives that authority, then troops can be used. So if we have a standing agreement that says if this nation is invaded and we have a treaty with that nation, then the president can immediately use troops based on the authorization of that treaty. So that's where you have statutory authorization from Congress or a case of a national emergency. So the president can also use this based on national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories, its possessions, or its armed forces. And this is where we kind of sit today, because if you look at just the extent of presidential power, this could include anything. This could include anything based on, like I said, an ally of ours that we have established over history being attacked or invaded, quote unquote, Ukraine. And that would perceivably empower the president to do a bunch of things. But the president still has to navigate that. The other thing is during Barack Obama's administration, we had the issue in Africa over Benghazi, and Barack Obama kind of made a thing of like, well, there's nothing I could do. There was nothing I could do. Actually, there was a lot more you could do. You may have chosen not to do it to inflame sensitivities in the area, but to suggest there was nothing you could do was somewhat inaccurate. We had a clear attack on an American armed forces and a clear attack on the embassy there in Benghazi to the extent where American soldiers and American diplomat died. And so we had the ability, but a lot of this, just because the president has the ability, remember, presidents are still caught in this kind of, I have to, on one hand, protect and defend this kind of global emerging world, but on the other hand, I have to not irritate my constituents. I have to not irritate my voters, and this kind of puts presidents in some conundrums. And if we give the voters this much control over foreign policy, it leads to somewhat calamitous ends, because now the voter has to decide what to do in Iraq, even though they have no idea where Iraq is on a map or what exactly the conflict is in Iraq. We have to have the voter decide Afghanistan, once again, even though they can't point it out on a map, they don't really understand the conflict. India and Pakistan, once again, that's a religious divide that goes back hundreds of years and sits on the precipice of civil war, and yet most Americans are completely ignorant of that, but they want to render an opinion every fourth year on what the president should do in global affairs. And so we have to reconcile this as a nation, because what what I'm going to show you is that because we have not reconciled this, the world is destabilizing because of the destabilization of the American nation, because of the destabilization of the American presidency. Over the last 20, 25 years, we have gone from, you've gone from Bill Clinton to W. Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And if you're the world looking for America to lead, if you're looking for consistency in the world, America has provided anything but consistency. And why is this important? Because it's inconsistency with a lot of power. And in some ways, this is why other nations have come to perceive the United States as an abusive nation. It's really kind of fascinating psychology when you look at the elements of abuse, that a lot of times abuse is perceived simply as inconsistency in action. That one day you're hitting a nation and punishing a nation, the next day you're like ignoring it, and the next day you're like congratulating it. Well, what action is going to be tolerated on the global scene? What leadership is going to be sound? In the absence of consistent leadership in the United States, other nations will begin to look elsewhere. They will begin looking at China. They'll be looking at Putin because they are consistent. They may not get as good of a deal, but a bad, consistent deal, it may be better than a maybe good, maybe not, somewhat consistent deal, because at the end of the day, the deal's not as good as, the president who signed it, because every deal is only as good as that president's tenure in office. And so this creates complications. Nonetheless, after the president does use troops, if he commits troops, the president must notify Congress within 2 days that he used troops. Now, look at this. Even though he has to notify Congress, he doesn't have to give specifics or a bunch of other stuff, and he can still use troops 60 days without authorization, with an additional 30 days for withdrawal. In other words, the president of the United States effectively has 90 days to do whatever they choose with the U.S. military, and this is kind of allowed by modern law. And again, because world circumstances kind of pull this into play, it's an important thing. So when you cast a vote for the president, this is what you're casting a vote to. And the world has changed dramatically since then. Like I showed you last time, the emergence of nuclear weapons really changes the desperate need for some stabilization in the world. And like I said, one of the cases I want to put into is Vietnam. Vietnam becomes a very interesting case when you start studying Vietnam. Vietnam was started by GOVT. We went in because the French actually had colonies set up in Vietnam. And they had used that for some time because we had an agreement or an alliance with the French from World War II. We actually went in to help the French. Well, the French then decide it's not in their interest to do it, and they bail. America then decides to stay the course. And a lot of this comes down to, once again, we make this about peace, democracy, freedom of choice, but we cannot negate the fact that there is an economic consideration in here as well. Indochina is one of the greatest producers of rubber in the world. And rubber can only be produced by a very specific rubber tree until we create a synthetic way to kind of create fake rubber, which we've done in the modern world. However, rubber is still the primary ingredient in a whole lot of stuff, including automobiles and tires. And so there's kind of this economic consideration that's wrapped into the political consideration. And this is why it's so hard for people to figure out America, because to what extent are we doing this for political reasons to kind of help the world understand their own value, and to what extent are we doing this for economic reasons? Well, if we actually protect the rubber in Vietnam, the first people who benefit from that are the Vietnamese. They actually have their most profound economic resource that is now able to go into the world and be bought and sold on a world market that's protected by the United States. However, right, this would also economically benefit the United States. And so there's always this kind of like give and take with the American interest. Nonetheless, JFK kind of begins the Vietnamese War, and not going to go over all the specifics here, but in a lot of ways, we botched this war quite dramatically. JFK botches Vietnam. LBJ really turns his interest nationally. And so because LBJ's interest is primarily on the Great Society, civil rights, squaring away the African American vote. I would argue, to a lot of extent, he really kind of mismanages Vietnam quite dramatically. So when Nixon inherits the office in 1968, Nixon inherits a mess in Vietnam. And the primary argument is we've secured South Vietnam. North Vietnam remains underneath the influence of Russia. But we've kind of drawn a line in the sand here and said, okay, y'all stand on your side, we'll stay on our side. And we're still seeing insurgency and conflict in South Vietnam, which is causing major problems because there's a lot of cultural elements to war, and our soldiers are losing the cultural battle. There's a lot of propaganda that's coming into South Vietnam that is speaking in the native tongue, in Vietnamese, and they're going into these villages and cultural groups and letting them know that the Americans are demons, the Americans are devil worshippers sent by Hades to destroy their wives and their children, giving them weapons and supplies. And so we're having soldiers kind of stumble into villages and get shot at by women and children, otherwise innocent women and children, except for the propaganda and whatnot that they have been told. And so we really have to figure out how are these weapons and supplies and propaganda materials getting into South Vietnam. This creates a problem. Well, underneath the Nixon administration, Nixon has to make a very difficult decision. The trail of supplies is what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's actually going around the border, right, between North and South Vietnam and feeding in all kinds of supplies throughout South Vietnam, which is undermining the American interest. Well, Nixon has a decision to make. Do you go into Laos? Do you go into Cambodia and blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Do you cut off the supply routes? Now, every single military strategist in the world would say, yes, this is completely, rational military action. And Nixon follows their cue and says, okay, we're going to go in and blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we did. We went in and blew up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the Ho Chi Minh Trail was being run by a lot of what we would consider non-combatants, people running wagons up and down the trail, people running supplies, people that are a lot of times caught in the grip of war and become collateral damage of war. Well, the difference in Vietnam is, remember, that in 1960, right, we have the first televised debate. Right. So what happens is by the time we get to 1968, and now we have television kind of beginning to overwhelm our nation, we actually allow TVs and TV reporters to go into Vietnam and broadcast the horrors of war. In other words, the American people are actually going to be able to see exactly what war looks like. And they did not like it. They did not like it. They could not stomach the reality of war. This is one of the reasons why no war since Vietnam has been broadcast to the extent that the Vietnam War was broadcast. Well, if we look at this, these journalists and whatnot are going in and they're taking pictures out of context, but nonetheless pictures. They're showing images. One of the most famous images of a child on fire. And people said this is unjust, this is cruel. How can we live in a world where soldiers cause such calamity? And we were, when the Vietnam soldiers came back, we spat upon them, we ridiculed them, we kicked them out of our nation. But even more than the soldiers, we blamed the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. And Vietnam was used quite dramatically to tear down the presidency and the authority of Richard Nixon. Now remember, 1972, Nixon won in a landslide. And so Nixon was a force in politics. And what happens in Vietnam is effectively the Democrat Party uses Vietnam very effectively to turn a lot of American sentiment not only against the American soldiers, but against the American president. And this is something, like I said, we have to kind of keep in mind, because by the time Nixon is done, before he resigns office, Nixon, because of his willingness to go in and blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, cut off the supplies, it forces North Vietnam into an agreement. And we actually settle a peace agreement with Vietnam. We end the Vietnam War peacefully, right? Or at least with promises of peace. Very similar to the way Eisenhower did Korea. North Vietnam was going to remain communist. South Vietnam was going to remain somewhat proto-democratic. They were still trying to figure out what that was. But we promised that South Vietnam, that if you have any further aggression by North Vietnam, that the American soldiers will come back. So South Vietnam was safe because they had America's backing. Well, what happens is, because the Democrats use Vietnam so effectively, the American sentiment turned against Vietnam so viciously. After Nixon's resignation, the American sentiment turned against the Republican Party as a whole, and we have a huge wave election happening with Jimmy Carter in 1976. And so a lot of the destabilization that happened under Jimmy Carter from 1976 to 1980 was actually not the fault of Jimmy Carter. I don't blame Jimmy Carter. We had demonized the presidency, and we had demonized the use of troops in foreign affairs. So Jimmy Carter really had both hands tied behind his back by a very kind of Democrat, liberal-leaning, Vietnam kind of sentimental Congress that really kept the president's options really at bay. And this is where we really begin to see this kind of destabilization that's possible after the American government has taken such a control of the world and such a control of world affairs. Because during Carter's administration is known for global, tumult. We have the Iranian hostage negotiation. We have issues falling apart. Carter is able to negotiate a peace between Egypt and Israel, which is quite dramatic, but he did so without guns, without weapons. I think Jimmy Carter, for my money, is actually one of the just one of the best human beings that has ever actually offered the presidency. And what he's able to do without firing a shot in the Middle East is quite impressive. And yet he never seems to get credit for that. However, because Congress really kind of gets to do funding, and because the social pressure against war, we really are in a conundrum with Vietnam, because they're watching our elections as well. And when the North Vietnamese figure out that Nixon has resigned, America's turned inward, they violate the treaty and they actually invade South Vietnam, and America does nothing. Not only does America do nothing, we're like, it's not a problem. We've washed our hands of this. This is outside of our control. And effectively what happens is thousands upon thousands of South Vietnam individuals that trusted the United States were slaughtered. We kept that off the TVs. We didn't show that. We wanted to ignore the calamity that happened after we left. Very, very, very similar to many years later when we left Afghanistan, and we had people falling out of airplanes, which we quickly removed from the media narrative. We were very, very quickly talking about the Kardashians once again, because we really didn't want to put that on the American television networks. And so we have this kind of reality today that Americans are in a world, our president has huge control of that world, but our president is caught between doing what is necessary in the world and doing what is popular at home. And this is somewhat an impassable chasm. And presidents have had to navigate this with some kind of tact and delicacy. Reagan, because the destabilization of Jimmy Carter, kind of stormed into office with this peace through strength nonsense. But because of the destabilization, he was able to go in. But the truth with Reagan is Reagan got away with a lot of rhetoric, largely because his vice president, H.W. Bush, was a very skilled, brilliant diplomat. Bush's meeting with Gorbachev, his work as vice president of the United States during that time is, in my humble estimation, one of the most brilliant tenures of a vice president in modern history. But he never challenged Reagan. He was Reagan's vice president, so it was not his job to try to take the limelight. It was Bush's job to make safe the world and do what was necessary. And so Bush is traveling the world as vice president, meeting with members of China, meeting with members of Russia, meeting and kind of stabilizing this world. So we have this kind of period of peace, that goes from 1980 with the beginning of Reagan all the way until the 1992 election of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton begins to destabilize with how China is treated. China has not, in the 1990s, lived up to World Trade Organization standards. However, Bill Clinton helps to work the mood to lower the standards to allow China into the World Trade Organization because it was eminently profitable. even though they had not yet shown that they were able and willing to follow all the rules. And so we see this kind of preferential trading in America kind of takes the economic route. The other thing is America gets caught in a subprime lending crisis as well. All of this is going to blow up in 2000 as the economics of the United States are going to fall apart with a couple different dot-com booms, a housing crisis, and then 9/11 is going to really rock the world with relative safety and security. And so we have this time period after Carter where we kind of restabilize a period of peace, but that period of peace was somewhat temporal. And we're here today trying to figure out how to get it back. W. Bush, we had this resolve for about 4 or 5 years until the election came back in. And then the same people that were in favor of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan quickly became against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, or argued that our president was a war criminal. A lot of that is politics. Most of that is politics, I would argue. Barack Obama comes in 2008 arguing that America has done no good in the world, that we have been a force for primarily selfish gain. And we should remove ourselves. But behind the scenes, to his credit, Barack Obama kept a lot of the American forces in play, and even kept on Bush's Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates. Trump comes in after Obama and says, no, America's the best world ever. We have to apologize for nothing. You will do what we say. Otherwise, we're going to put really big bombs in place. And Trump is notable for letting the military officials drop the father of all bombs, one of the largest bombs used since World War II. And so when we start looking at this, Trump kind of came in with this kind of Theodore Roosevelt, carry a big stick. And then Biden comes in and says, no, we need to pull out of everywhere. We have no responsibility telling the world how to live their life. We're going to basically pull troops out of the most contentious areas the last 20 years and leave them to their own devices, effectively declaring losses in the Middle East. And this is going to be significant because, like I said, moving forward, if you're one of these third world countries that is trying to build an economy and some sort of Republican form of government, can you trust America? Or is a trust in America limited only to who's currently in the White House? And this is a big question if you're a foreign leader trying to do this. The other thing we have to keep in mind is America's own hypocrisy. Domestic authorities since World War during war, even though FDR gets a pass of being this kind of great humanitarian, Korematsu versus the United States actually asked the question of, during wartime, do you have rights? Effectively, what's the question? If we are caught in a position of war and your rights conflict with national security, do you really have rights if national security is in the question? And in Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court effectively said, no, you do not. In this case, Korematsu was an American-born citizen, which was supposed to have entire rights, but after the attack of Pearl Harbor, all Japanese citizens were charged to go into internment camps. We don't want to call them concentration camps. They were humane to the extent that you can say that they were humane, but they weren't like German concentration camps, work camps, or death camps. They were confinement. They were prisons of sorts, and all Japanese Americans were confined to them because we blamed Hawaii on Japanese influence, that Hawaii and Pearl Harbor was only able to attack because of spies and these things. So FDR effectively made Japanese Americans the enemy of American security and used this demonization very effectively in his campaigns. And so when he ordered that they are in internment camps, Americans loved this. They thought that was the president protecting them, the president defending them. And FDR's own attorney general said the Constitution has not greatly bothered any wartime president. In other words, during times of war, your rights or your supposed rights kind of fall by the wayside. We saw this kind of double down in the Patriot Act. We've seen this kind of time and time again. And even though we had an American citizen that took this to the Supreme Court and said, I had rights and my rights should have been respected during this time, the Supreme Court said, yeah, you have rights, but if there is no nation to defend your rights. Therefore, the nation trumps your rights. Every president has kind of like said that this was a bad decision, it was a poor decision, but it has not been overturned. Every president has still operated with the power that this decision has allowed. So there's kind of like a doublespeak here for presidents. We really do see see this. And this leads to what we call Wadowski's two presidents theory, that you really have two presidents in America. You have this presidency that's the president of the nation, that is kind of like the head bureaucrat that kind of has to work popularity and public opinion and whatnot. And this president really doesn't have a whole lot of power because they're limited quite extensively by the Constitution, by Congress, by a lot of different stuff. However, the other president is the president of national defense, and the nation of America is a global force. That president is largely unlimited in power and has full scoop to not only raise nations, but also destroy them. And so we have this kind of domestic presidency and this foreign presidency. And since the power of the presidency is really here, it's not by any consequence that we tend to maintain some type of war, because during times of war, the president powers does go up quite dramatically. Even right now, even though Biden has pulled out of Afghanistan, the American troops have not come home from everywhere. We still have an extensive military network across the globe. And so this is something we have to keep in mind. Remember, of all the threats, this is what the president has to navigate. The world is a complicated, messy place, and the president does have to navigate this. The rest of this, I'm not going to go over. The book covered this pretty well, The Words We Live By, on what is the difference between a treaty and a presidential or an executive agreement. Know the difference between those two. The biggest thing you need to know here is the last time we had the big treaty was Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations after World War I. And since the Senate killed the League of Nations, it really kind of forced modern presidents to usurp congressional oversight. And so they use executive agreements in lieu of treaties. And what that means is the treaty would be binding for all presidents in the future. Executive agreements can be made by our president and any foreign nation at the whim of the president, essentially. But it only lasts as long as that president is in power, which means the next president would have to decide whether or not to honor the agreement or not. In other words, executive agreements are far more unstable than treaties are, but treaties are a lot more difficult to get. Not treaties, it's not what we're doing. So we have this, if I look at prior to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's reign, we only had about 1,200 executive agreements that were passed in the world. Now, some of this is how the presidents operated. Some of this was the limitations of the American involvement in the world. However, since America's emergence, we have had more than 18,000 now executive agreements emerged. Same thing here, executive agreements versus treaty in that same time period. We've seen treaties used very, very limitedly. And this continues to go to destabilize the elements, because executive agreements only last so long as the president's in office. So the executive agreements that Donald Trump made, they're no longer intact with Biden's up until the point that Biden decides to keep them intact. And if you have Biden with a very different foreign policy, a lot of what Trump said was going to be the case is no longer the case, providing a huge element of inconsistency for world nations. The other thing, like I said earlier, is if the president does this, remember the president's supposed to have kind of war-making power, but only with the allowance of Congress. But remember, we haven't declared war since World War II. So most of our conflicts over the past, since World War II, have been done by presidential action alone. The president has to get top-secret information, decide what to do with that information. A lot of times he cannot share that information because of national security considerations. And so we really are living in a world where the president has to navigate the most sophisticated, most confidential international security questions. And we had an election of Biden versus Donald Trump. I mean, it's when you understand what the president does, the entire last couple of elections are just comical. And so one of the things I want to leave you with is, I told you H.W. Bush as vice president was so critically important in my mind. There's a great book called When the World Seemed New that kind of details a lot of this. But what made Bush good was he understood the diplomatic element of leading through diplomacy and peace and strength of character rather than strength of ring. So speaking at a joint news conference, the Soviet leader announced, so this is a Soviet leader speaking of kind of thing, he said, the world is leaving one epoch and entering another. We are at the beginning of a long road to lasting peaceful era. The threat of force, mistrust, psychological and ideological struggle should all be things of the past. based on Bush's leadership, what are we seeing? We're seeing an agreement between Russia and the United States, which is also being reconciled in China as well. And they're saying that the threat of force, mistrust, psychological, and ideological struggles should all be things of the past. I assure the President of the United States that I will never start a hot war against the United States. In reply, President Bush said, "We can realize a lasting peace and transform the East-West relationship to one of enduring cooperation. That is the future that Chairman Gorbachev and I began right here in Malta." That there was leadership, and that leadership was dedicated to peace so that we could do this, right? This was another AP News brief on looking at H.W. Bush's leadership and whatnot. And in the wake of his death, this is something that came out in the newspaper. H.W. Bush's death. He said Bush always took a balanced approach to things. He was not one to rush to take everything into He was not one to rush and took everything into account. He was always very well briefed. Gorbachev was too, and together they just looked for common ground. All right, one thing said to distinguish Bush from from other U.S. presidents was his understanding of Gorbachev's political situation and a professed desire not to put Gorbachev in a corner at the time when others in the Soviet leader were not thrilled with rapprochement. He was in many respects very different from Ronald Reagan. Reagan was an intuitive politician, while Bush was analytical, and in some ways more political. He understood that developments in Eastern Europe were not easy for Gorbachev. He never put Gorbachev on the spot. This relationship allowed Bush and Gorbachev to push through some of the most significant U.S.-Russia arms control agreements in history, including the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. They found that mutual arms reduction was the cornerstone of stability between their nations. And so as we look at this notion of making safe the world, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of things, but we have the model in place. The question is, are we, the American people, able to see it? And when we had it, why did we so carelessly toss it aside? Our elections have consequences, not just for us, but for the entire world. The loss of Unit 2 is a federal bureaucracy. This is covered, like I said, pretty notably in the book. These are also, the units are here, and so I'm not going to kind of dwell on this too much. We get into executive privilege and whatnot, but like I said, Words We Live By covers this last little bit pretty well. I will see you on the flip side of the next lecture. We'll dive into the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court is supposed to be and what it has become. Some more fun stuff ahead. Until then, I bid you all adieu. I wish you the best, and I'll see you next time.